In this peaceful spot by the River Brent in West London, St Mary's Perivale has stood for nearly 900 years. Surrounded by its peaceful churchyard, it has survived storms, wars, famines, plagues, and even developers. Acquired in 1976 by a charity set up for the purpose, it has now become one of the most important classical music venues in Britain. We're too small for orchestras, but our size and acoustics give us a perfect venue for chamber music and instrumental recitals. During the recent pandemic, we were not allowed to have a live audience, but we have not only survived but actually thrived by live streaming our concerts. Now, we are thrilled to be able to readmit an audience, but the live streams continue as an essential part of our offering. So, wherever you are, enjoy this concert, and please consider donating via our website. Thank you very much indeed. So we leave them up, and it's a sort of repository of what's gone on here. Good afternoon and welcome back to St Mary's Perivale, a special event this afternoon, a words and music event put on by Christopher Kent and Gamal Khamis. And you're in for a treat. We saw this show about 6 years ago or so about the World War I, and it was intensely moving, and I think you'll find it intensely moving again. We've got a full church here ready to enjoy this special presentation. So without more ado, I'm going to ask the audience to put their hands together to give a big warm welcome, please.
Those long, uneven lines, standing as patiently as if they were stretched outside the Oval or Villa Park. The crowns of hats, the sun on moustached, archaic faces, grinning as if it were all an August bank holiday lark. And the shut shops, the bleached established names on the sunblinds, the farthings and sovereigns and dark-clothed children at play, called after kings and queens. The tin advertisement for cocoa and twist, and the pubs wide open all day. And the countryside not caring. The place names all hazed over with flowering grasses, and fields shadowing doomsday lines under wheat's restless silence. the differently dressed servants with tiny rooms in huge houses, the dust behind limousines. Never such innocence, never before or since has changed itself to past without a word. The men leaving the gardens tidy, the thousands of marriages lasting a little while longer. Never such innocence again. Britain in 1914 was in the middle of a long, hot summer. Everybody still wore hats, nearly all the men smoked, there were more horses on the streets than cars, and the British Empire stretched around the globe with a quarter of the world's population under its rule. But beneath this apparent stability, the sands were shifting, and when war broke out between the major powers of Europe, few people understood the true consequences. The devastating conflict over the next 4 years was to cost countless millions of lives. And yet it was also an extraordinary time of flowering in the creative arts. Painters were bursting out of the frame. Composers on both sides of the Atlantic were challenging convention. And it seems everybody was writing. We know of over 2,500 published poets during the 4 years of what was then called the Great War, far more than any other conflict before or since. So why was that? Why so much writing? Well, for one thing, at a time just after the great education reforms of the previous 40 years, and before the invention of radio, telephones, and television, writing was the common currency of human communication. Everybody who did write could write. Do you know, there were 4 postal deliveries a day at that time. And handwritten letters between husbands, wives, businesses, and lovers were the way human relationships were transacted. And by extension, many people read and wrote poetry. It was a truly popular art form. But there was something else as well. There was such an extraordinary journey of understanding to be travelled during those 4 years. It's hard to imagine now, but when war first broke out in August 1914, it was greeted by many people as a reason for celebration. There was a widespread feeling that the youth of the nation had become slothful and indolent in the absence of any military conflict since the end of the Boer War in 1902. And it was felt that in some way military service might be ennobling and purifying, that perhaps it might, to coin a now familiar phrase, make Britain great again. So that's really where this story starts, with poets who saw themselves as literary recruitment officers, many of them, to begin with, from the English public schools, brought up on lofty notions of heroism and sacrifice. And foremost amongst them was the figure of Rupert Brooke, a glamorous character said to be so good-looking that people turned to look at him in the street when he first went to Cambridge. He was already a published poet, and he now rushed into print with a sequence of what he called war sonnets, the most famous of which is called The Soldier, and begins with the famous lines, "If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England." Words that were to develop a terrible irony as the war went on, as we shall see. But we're going to begin with a less well-known poem from the same set, strangely entitled Peace, in which he picks up on this almost biblical notion of purification through sacrifice. He says that young men going to war will shake off their shame, that they'll be like swimmers into cleanness leaping. And then, at the other end of the literary spectrum, then as now, with the tabloid rabble-rousers, people like Jessie Pope, a poet and journalist who saw it as her responsibility to encourage, and if necessary, shame young men into joining up. Her poem, The Call, is vivid, crude, and highly effective. But first, Peace by Rupert Brooke. Now God be thanked, who has matched us with his hour, and caught our youth, and wakened us from sleeping, with hand made sure, clear eye, and sharpened power, to turn as swimmers into cleanness leaping. Glad from a world grown old and cold and weary, leave the sick hearts that honour could not move, and half men and their dirty songs and dreary, and all the little emptiness of love. Oh, we who have known shame have found release there, where there's no ill, no grief, but sleep has mending, nor broken save this body, lost but breath, nothing to shake the lasting hearth, long peace there, but only agony, and that has ending. And the worst friend and enemy is but death. The Call. Who's for the trench? Are you, my laddie? Who'll follow French? Will you, my laddie? Who's fretting to begin? Who's going out to win? And who wants to save his skin? Do you, my laddie? Who's for the khaki suit? Are you, my laddie? Who longs to charge and shoot? Do you, my laddie? Who's keen on getting fit? Who means to show his grit? And who'd rather wait a bit? Would you, my laddie? Who'll earn the empire's thanks? Will you, my laddie? Who'll swell the victor's ranks? Will you, my laddie? When that procession comes, banners and rolling drums, who'll stand and bite his thumbs? Will you, my laddie? drive was extremely successful. Soon Lord Kitchener's famous poster sprang up everywhere. There were queues a mile long outside recruitment offices. And incredibly, during that first year, 2.5 million young men enlisted from every walk of life. One of them was a young picture framer's apprentice, aged only 19, called Percy O'Key. He left his home in Hull, a place he'd perhaps never left before, to join the East Yorkshire Regiment, known as the Hull Pals. And this is where the story starts to become personal to me, because some years ago, after the death of an elderly aunt in my family, I was given this box that had been left to me in her will and handed down through the family. On it was written the name Percy. And inside, there was a framed photograph of a handsome, stocky young man in a private's uniform. There were a few faint pencil-written letters from the front, some official documents, a medal, and this ragged old notebook. Over time, we were able to piece together the events of the next few years of this young man's life, the story that I'm telling you today. Not so different from the lives of many other recruits of Kitchener's New Army, as it became known, except in one respect, because it turned out that Percy O'Key had been my great-uncle. I never knew him, but he was the brother of my grandmother, my mother's mother, who we knew very well growing up, and the resemblance between them was striking. What Percy O'Key and his comrades found when they finally arrived in northern France must have been very different to anything any of them could ever have imagined. The two sides had almost literally dug in to mostly low-lying rural farmland to form a front line that stretched from the North Sea right down to the Swiss border, from which they peered at each other across trenches which in some places were as close as 50 meters apart. And this new reality is reflected in a new wave of soldier poets, many of them now from humbler working backgrounds, who began to write about the lives they now found themselves living, in almost constantly wet conditions, with rats everywhere, in constant danger from heavy artillery bombardment, gas attacks, sniper fire, and the wickedly effective new invention, the machine gun. Men like Isaac Rosenberg, the diminutive son of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants who lived a poverty-stricken life in London's East End. He left school at 14, like Percy O'Key and most working-class people then, and was a self-taught artist and poet. He was so short that he had to join one of the specially designated bantam regiments for those under the official joining height of 5'3". His dryly humorous poem, Break of Day in the Trenches, with its description of the queer, sardonic rat with its cosmopolitan sympathies that he meets in the trench, vividly captures the daily realities of a private soldier's life. And then David Jones, another self-taught artist and poet, the son of a Welsh father who joined the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. He survived the war and much later in 1937 published In Parenthesis, a strangely hypnotic work, part novel, part epic poem in which he recounts his war experiences. In the extract we'll hear, he captures exactly the nature of the landscape and the particular challenges it will present to both attacker and defender alike. But first, Break of Day in the Trenches. The darkness crumbles away. It's the same old druid time as ever. Only a live thing leaps my hand, a queer sardonic rat, as I pull the parapet's poppy to stick behind my ear. Droll rat. They would shoot you if they knew your cosmopolitan sympathies. Now you've touched this English hand, you'll do the same to a German soon, no doubt, if it be your pleasure to cross the sleeping green between. It seems you inwardly grin as you pass, fine eyes, strong limbs, haughty athletes, less chance than you for life, bonds to the whims of murder, sprawled in the bowels of the earth, the torn fields of France. What do you see in our eyes of the shrieking iron and flame hurled through still heavens? What quaver? What heart aghast? Poppies, whose roots are in men's veins, drop and are ever dropping. But mine in my ear is safe, just a little white with the dust. The full day was clear after the early rain. The great flats under the vacant sky spread very far, the astonishing expanse of sky. Truly, the unseen wind had little but your nice body for its teeth. This was a country where men, since their first habitation, had not to rest but to dike and drain if they would outwit the water, or else leave the place to foul and amphibious beasts. It was a bad country to contend in when such contention most required a way of life below the ground. Two armies face and hold their crumbling limits intact. They're worthy of an intelligent song for all the stupidity of their contest. A boast for the dike keepers, for the march wardens. But it wasn't just young people who were drawn into the war. The writer Edward Thomas was a mature man of 36 and already the father of 3 children when war broke out in August 1914. At that point, he'd managed to eke together a meager living as a writer of literary reviews and nature journals, and had only recently begun writing poetry with the encouragement of his friend, the American poet Robert Frost. Thomas was an anti-nationalist and appalled by the jingoistic tub-thumping of the press, but he was also extremely concerned by the threat as he saw it from abroad, and particularly to his beloved English countryside. It was one of Robert Frost's own poems, The Road Not Taken, that was to have a profound effect upon Edward Thomas. He seems to have seen in its depiction of a wanderer confronted by a choice of 2 paths in a wood, a reflection of his own dilemma about the war, and it influenced his decision to join up in late 1915. Robert Frost was horrified and tried unsuccessfully to dissuade him. We'll hear The Road Not Taken in a moment, followed by one of Edward Thomas's own poems from this period, As the Team's Head Brass, in which, as in so much of his writing, the war is an offstage presence taking place in the distance. As the Team's Head Brass is rather like a film script. The team of the title is a team of shire horses who are pulling an old-fashioned plough. And the brass is their head brass, is the brassware on their bridle, which glints in the sunlight every time they reach the top of the field that they're mowing or ploughing of the weed charlock. The poet sits in a fallen tree and talks to the ploughman every time he reaches the end of his furrow. And the poem is framed by the 2 lovers who disappear into the woods at the beginning for presumably amorous purposes and emerge at the end, perhaps symbolizing the hope of new life, in contrast to the destruction of the distant war towards which the poet is inexorably drawn. First, The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other, as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. As the team's head brass flashed out on the turn, the lovers disappeared into the wood. I sat in the boughs of the fallen elm, which strewed an angle of the fallow, and watched the plough narrowing a yellow square of charlock. Every time the horses turned, instead of treading me down, the ploughman leaned upon his handles to say or ask a word about the weather, next about the war. Scraping the share, he screwed along the furrow until the brass flashed once more. A blizzard felled the elm whose crest I sat in by a woodpecker's round hole. The ploughman said, "Have you been out yet?" "No." "And don't want to, perhaps?" "If I could only come back again, I should. I could spare an arm. I shouldn't want to lose a leg. If I should lose my head, why so? I should want nothing more." "Have many been from here?" "Yes." "Many lost?" "Yes, a good few. Only 2 teams work on the farm this year. One of my mates is dead. The second day in France they killed him. Was back in March, the very night of the blizzard too. Now if he had stayed here, we should have moved the tree. And I should not have sat in it. Everything would have been different, for it would have been another world. Aye, and a better, though if we could see all might seem good. Then the lovers came out of the wood again, The horses started, and for the last time I watched the clods crumble and topple over behind the ploughshare and the stumbling team. By now, the effects of the war were being felt at home as well as at the front. There were shortages in the shops, and income tax had been doubled to pay for the war effort. Then, in May 1915, the civilian transatlantic cruise liner was sunk off the coast of Ireland by a German U-boat with the loss of all 1,198 civilian lives on board. The Germans maintained it had been illicitly carrying munitions and was therefore a legitimate target. But the country was deeply shocked. Among those on board were some friends of the English composer, Frank Bridge, Paul and Gladys Crompton, who died along with their 9-year-old daughter, Catherine. Bridge, a lifelong pacifist and later teacher of Benjamin Britten, poured all of his anguish into a work he simply called Lament for Catherine, age 9, Lusitania, 1915. By June 1916, Private Percy O'Key was serving with the 8th Battalion of the East Yorkshire Regiment, stationed just outside Amiens on the northern banks of the River Somme. Dear sisters, he writes on June the 11th, 1916, just a few lines to say I received parcels safe and thank you all very much. It will come in handy as we're just going into the trenches, so we're having a good feed. I've not received a letter from Brother George yet, but perhaps I shall before long. I had a letter from Mr. Craycroft and he said he'd sent some fags, but I've not received them yet. But he addressed them to the Earl place and they'll be long of coming. Well, I've not much time to write just now, but we'll write later. Did you get those cards all right, which I sent? Thank Uncle George for the cigs and tell him I will fire a shot or two at the Germans for him. Your brother, Percy. It's clear to us now, as it almost certainly wouldn't have been to Percy and his comrades at the time, that when he talks about being sent into the trenches, they were almost certainly being moved forward for the huge offensive that came to be known as the Battle of the Somme. First, over a 7-day period, an astonishing 1.6 million shells were rained down on the enemy positions. It was assumed this would pulverize their defenses and cut through the extensive barbed wire entanglements that had been set up to defend them. So that in the words of the red-faced, mustachioed British commander at the front, Lieutenant General Aylmer Hunter Weston, known amongst the men as General Hunter Bunter, the troops could walk straight in. But in fact, many of the shells under or overshot their targets. The wire wasn't cut in most places. And during the preceding months of deadlock, the defending forces had had time to construct sophisticated bomb-proof shelters, in some places as much as 30 meters deep. So that when, in the early hours of the 1st of July 1916, the bombardment finally ceased, and it became clear that the attack was about to begin, they simply emerged from their bunkers and manned their machine gun positions, with devastating consequences. A generation or two earlier, a single-shot rifle had been able to fire once every 90 seconds, so that a defensive position could eventually be overrun by sheer force of numbers attacking on foot. But now, the new machine guns, in those same 90 seconds, could pump out 1,500 bullets. On the blast of each trench commander's whistle, the troops were ordered to clamber onto the parapets of their trenches, form into lines in their thousands, and walk, not run, across no man's land towards the enemy positions. The resulting carnage came to be known in some quarters as Hunter Bunter's Folly. We presume Private Percy O'Key must have been among them. We don't have his version of events, but Private Frank Lindley from the neighbouring 14th York and Lancaster Regiment recounts, "You could hear the bullets whistling past, and our lads were going down, flop, flop, flop in their waves, just as though they'd all gone to sleep. I were in the first wave. There were no cheering, we just ambled across, you hadn't a thought. You were so addled with the noise. Out of the corner of your eye, you could see the boys going down, but there were no going back. They had what we called whippers in with revolvers, and they could shoot you if anybody came back. So we moved forward as best we could. Bullets were like a swarm of bees around you. You could almost feel them plucking at your clothes. Them that made it as far as their wire were all piled up where the machine guns had just laid them out, or they were caught on the wire, hanging there like rags, and shot to bits." At the end of that first day, there were 57,470 British casualties, and almost 20,000 lay dead. It was and remains the bloodiest single day in British military history. The battle went on till November, by which time there were more than 1 million casualties on all sides. And during that time, the British managed to advance just 6 miles, which meant that each mile gained came at a cost of 88,000 lives. As it turned out, Percy O'Key was among the luckier ones. His notebook recounts that he was wounded in an attack on an enemy trench on July the 16th, but eventually invalided back home to recuperate at a military hospital in England, a favourable outcome known amongst the troops as catching a blighty. But it didn't always work out like that. In the overcrowded field hospitals of the time, even a slight wound could mean death from infection. Amputation was often a first rather than last resort. And worse, sometimes the wounded lay in agony in shell holes in no man's land for days on end. This emerging theme of lions led by donkeys is what characterizes our next group of poems. Siegfried Sassoon was an independently wealthy young man and already a published poet when he was commissioned into the army on the eve of war in 1914. He was awarded the Military Cross for his bravery in rescuing wounded comrades from behind enemy lines, and was known by his men as Mad Jack for his reckless daring. But he became increasingly incensed by what he saw as the out-of-touch generals at the front and the moralizing members of the establishment back home. We'll hear a couple of his biting epigrammatic satires from this period. First, a poem he simply called They, which he wrote on reading the transcript of a particularly pompous sermon by the then Bishop of London. And incidentally, the poem caused a minor outrage because it included the word syphilitic in acknowledgement of the otherwise unacknowledged of the presence of sexual disease amongst troops at the front. And then a companion piece called Base Details. They, by Siegfried Sassoon. The bishop tells us, when the boys come back, they'll not be the same, for they'll have fought in a just cause. They lead the last attack on Antichrist. Their comrade's blood has bought new right to breed an honourable race. They have challenged death and dared him face to face. We're none of us the same, the boys replied. For George lost both his legs and Bill's stone blind. Poor Jim's shot through the lungs and like to die, and Bert's gone syphilitic. You'll not find a chap who served who hasn't found some change. And the bishop said, the ways of God are strange. Base details. If I were fierce and bald and short of breath, I'd live with scarlet majors at the base and speed glum heroes up the line to death. You'd see me with my puffy, petulant face, guzzling and gulping in the best hotel, reading the roll of honour. Poor young chap, I'd say, I used to know his father well. Yes, it seems we've lost heavily in this last scrap. Then, when the war is done and youth stone dead, I toddle safely home and die in bed. And on a similar theme of the ignorance of those at home, a poem called My Sweet Old Etc. by the American modernist poet E. Cummings, who served as an ambulance driver at the front. People have often found Cummings' work forbidding because he doesn't use any capital letters or punctuation, and his words are strewn across the page with apparently random spacing. But as we'll see, it's actually the spaces that lend the poem its acerbic humour. Another ambulance driver at the front, though I don't think they ever met, was the French composer Maurice Ravel. He composed a suite of pieces called the Tombeau de Couperin, each one commemorating a fallen comrade. When he was asked about the apparently jaunty nature of some of the music, he simply replied, there is enough sadness. My sweet old etc. and Lucy, during the recent war, could, and what is more did, tell you just what everybody was fighting for. My sister, Isabel, created hundreds and hundreds of socks, not to mention shirts, flea-proof ear warmers, etc., wristers, etc. My mother hoped that I would die, etc. Bravely, of course. My father used to become hoarse, saying how it was a privilege and if only he could. Meanwhile, my self, etc., lay quietly in the deep mud, etc., dreaming, etc., of your smile, eyes, knees, and of your etc. Siegfried Sassoon's mordant humour had boiled over. At the beginning of April 1917, he was struck in the chest by a sniper's bullet and invalided back home to recuperate at a military hospital in Formby. While he was there, in Lancashire, near to Liverpool, in a fit of fury, he took his military cross and flung it into the River Mersey and sat down and wrote and published what he called a soldier's declaration. I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority, because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. I am a soldier, convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that this war, on which I entered as a war of defense and liberation, has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I have seen and endured the sufferings of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolong these sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. On behalf of those that are suffering now, I make this protest against the deception which is being practiced on them. Also, I believe that I may help to destroy the callous complacency with which the majority of those at home regard the contrivance of agonies which they do not and which they have not sufficient imagination to realize. Sassoon's status as a decorated war hero of aristocratic stock ensured that his declaration had immediate impact. It was published in the Times and even read out in the House of Commons. He was under no illusions as to the seriousness of what he'd done. Many people considered it an act of treason, and he fully expected to be court-martialed. But the ways of the British establishment are infinitely subtle when it comes to protecting one of their own. A medical board was hastily convened. Representations were made, and it was concluded that Siegfried Sassoon must have been suffering from shell shock, and therefore couldn't possibly have meant what he'd written, and therefore couldn't be held responsible for it. A defence which notably was not available to the 306 British soldiers of lower ranks who were executed for desertion and cowardice during the course of the war, many of whom undoubtedly were suffering from shell shock. In any event, Siegfried Sassoon was packed off to Craiglockhart Military War Hospital in Edinburgh, and his grand declaration had precisely no effect on the progress or outcome of the war. But it did affect our perception of it, because one afternoon, while he was there at Craiglockhart, there was a knock on the door from a nervous young lieutenant with a noticeable stammer caused by the neurasthenia or shell shock he was suffering from, who asked if he wouldn't mind signing some copies of Sassoon's published poetry, and mentioned in passing that he'd written a few things himself. He was Wilfred Owen. And so began one of the great literary friendships, as a result of which nearly all of Owen's best-known poetry came to be written in that last year of the war that followed, and which ever since has affected the way we think of what we now call the First World War. To begin with, Siegfried Sassoon was a little bit dismissive. He refers to him in his diary as that interesting little fellow. But he quickly became aware of the quality of the writing. And in the manuscripts of Wilfred Owen's poems from this period, you can quite clearly see the handwritten annotations and suggestions made by Siegfried Sassoon as he sought to bring out the instinctive metaphorical power of the writing. We'll hear a couple of Wilfred Owen's poems from this period. In a moment, one called The Sentry, which takes a moment first referred to in a letter to his mother in January 1917, when he describes being stuck in what he calls an old Boche dugout, under enemy fire with his men, and a sentry is hit in the eye and blinded. He takes this one moment and expands it into a vivid and nightmarish narrative. But first, one of Wilfred Owen's best-known poems, Anthem for Doomed Youth, in which it is the sheer strangeness of his comparison of a battlefield to a work of funeral liturgy, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, which makes it linger in the mind so powerfully. What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns. Only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds. We'd found an old Boche dugout, and he knew, for shell on frantic shell hammered on top, but never quite burst through. Rain guttering down in waterfalls of slime kept slush waist high, which falling hour on hour choked up the steps too thick with clay to climb. What murk of air remained stank old and sour with fumes of whiz-bangs, and the smell of men who'd lived their years and left their curse in the den, if not their corpses. There we herded from the blast of whiz-bangs till one found our door at last, buffeting eyes and breath, snuffing the candles, and thud, flump, thud, down the steeps came thumping, and splashing in the flood, deluging muck the sentry's body. Then his rifle, handles of old Boche bombs, and mud in ruck on ruck. We dredged him up for killed, until he whined, "Oh, sir, my eyes, I'm blind, I'm blind, I'm blind." Coaxing, I held a flame against his lid and said that if he could see the least blurred light, he was not blind. In time, he'd get all right. "I can't," he sobbed. Eyeballs, huge, bulged like squids, watch my dreams still. But I forgot him there in posting next for duty and sending a scout to beg a stretcher somewhere and floundering about to other posts under the shrieking air. Those other wretches, how they bled and spewed, and one who would have drowned himself for good. I try not to think of these things now. Let dread hark back for one word only, how? Half listening to that sentry's moans and jumps, and the wild chattering of his broken teeth, renewed most horribly whenever crumps pummeled the roof and slogged the air beneath. Through the dense din, I say, we heard him shout, "I see your lights!" But ours had long died out. One senses his rising anger. But it's in his great poem, Dulce et Decorum Est, that this finally erupts into white-hot fury, not just at the cruel and senseless suffering at the front, but also at what he saw as the moralizing members of the establishment back home. The lines that end this poem, Dulce et Decorum Est pro patria mori, are from the Latin poet Horace and mean literally, it is sweet and honorable to die for one's country. Sentiments which were trotted out rather too glibly and often for Wilfred Owen's liking in the press back home. In the manuscript of this poem, at the top, there's a dedication in Wilfred Owen's own handwriting which says, "To a certain poetess." But underneath that, and heavily scratched out, you can just about see that he'd originally written to Jessie Pope. Remember her? "Who's to the trench? Are you, my laddie?" So when at the end of this poem he turns on the reader and says, if you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, his target is very clear. Not just Jessie Pope, but all those right down to our present age who would like to suggest that there is something noble and glorious about violent death in warfare. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quick boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If, in some smothering dreams, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from his froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friends, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent from some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. All over Europe, the walls were coming down. The Russian Revolution took place in 1917. And closer to home, there'd been the Easter Rising against British rule in Ireland in 1916. Then in April 1918, there was a general strike in Dublin against conscription to the British Army. And it may have been for this reason that Percy O'Key, after a month's leave at home with his family in Hull, was dispatched to join the King's Liverpool Regiment at Cork in Western Ireland. Dear sisters, he writes on the 13th of May 1918, now I have reached my destination. I've not had time to look round, but it looks a decent place from the barracks, and I can find time to write a few lines to let you know I'm going on all right. I received your welcome letter today and was pleased to hear all at home are enjoying the best of health. Well, I hope it is a fine weekend and you'll have a jolly time at Withensea, and I would not mind being down there with you. Well,
It is lovely weather here today, and I'm on guard, so I'm writing these few lines before I go on duty. Well, I've not much more to say this time, only I wish this lot were all over and we could soon get back home again. Give my best love to Mother, and accept same yourselves. Cheerio, your loving brother, Percy.
But there were many who never did go home. Edward Thomas, the poet Ted Hughes called the father of us all, was killed in the blast of a stray shell just 2 months after finally arriving in northern France in February 1917. Little Isaac Rosenberg was killed on a night patrol in April 1918. Wilfred Owen survived to the very last week of the war before he was cut down by machine gun fire on November the 4th, 1918, 105 years ago yesterday. His mother received the telegram notifying her of his death exactly a week later, on November the 11th, just as the bells at her local church in Shrewsbury were ringing out news of the armistice. Rupert Brooke, the self-styled warrior poet, hardly saw any action at all before he died of a blood infection sustained from an insect bite on board a troop ship en route to the Dardanelles campaign in Turkey. He was hastily buried on the nearby Greek island of Skyros, in legend the home of Achilles. I went there once. His grave lies in isolation at the southern tip of the island, on the edge of an olive grove looking out over the blue waters of the Aegean. And engraved on the bright white marble of his tombstone, of course, are the words, "If I should die, think only this of me, that there is some corner of a foreign field that is forever England." It wasn't at all the end he'd envisaged for himself. Not the corner of a battlefield, just the corner of a field. But somehow in this desolate place there was a strange and ironic aptness about the words that he'd written. And even for those who survived, there was often no real peace. Ivor Gurney was the son of a Gloucester tailor and prodigiously gifted as both a poet and composer. At the Royal College of Music, his professor, Charles Villiers Stanford, who also taught Holst and Vaughan Williams, said of him that he was the greatest genius he'd ever taught, if the least teachable. He survived the war, but was wounded, gassed, and probably shell-shocked. And his already fragile mental equilibrium was shattered. After a chaotic, if productive, few years, there were several failed or aborted suicide attempts, and his desperate family had him declared insane and committed to an asylum, at first near their home in Gloucester, and then when he escaped by bursting through a plate glass window at the secure City of London mental hospital at Dartford in Kent. He was visited there by Helen Thomas, the widow of the poet Edward Thomas, and we'll hear her tender account of their meeting in a moment, followed by some of Ivor Gurney's own music and writing. But it's perhaps not surprising that some of the most heartfelt writing and art about loss was by women artists. And of course, that loss was universal. In Germany, the artist and sculptor Käthe Kollwitz waved her beloved 18-year-old son Peter off to the front in August 1914, and he was dead 6 weeks later. She wrote, "It is my duty as an artist to bear witness to the suffering of people, suffering that will never end and is as high as the mountains." She later produced the deeply moving sculpture of a mother cradling her dead adult son, which now sits as the centerpiece of the German National Monument to the victims of war and tyranny in Berlin. Closer to home, Vera Brittain served as a voluntary aid detachment nurse in London, Malta, and France, and later wrote Testament of Youth, her defining memoir of the period. She watched as her brother, her fiancé, and countless other friends and relatives disappeared off to the front, never to return. This is her touching lament, called simply Perhaps, written on receiving news of the death of her fiancé, Roland Leighton, by sniper fire. Perhaps someday the sun will shine again, and I will see that still the skies are blue, and feel once more I do not live in vain, although bereft of you. Perhaps the golden meadows at my feet will make the sunny hours of spring seem gay, and I shall find white May blossoms sweet, though you have passed away. Perhaps the summer woods will shimmer bright, and crimson roses once again be fair, and autumn harvest fields a rich delight, although you are not there. Perhaps someday I shall not shrink in pain to see the passing of the dying year, and listen to Christmas songs again, although you cannot hear. But though kind time may many joys renew, there is one greatest joy I shall not know again, for my heart for loss of you was broken long ago. From Under Storm's Wing by Helen Thomas. We arrived at the asylum, which looked like, as indeed it was, a prison. A warder let us in after unlocking the door, and doors were opened and locked behind us as we were ushered into the building. We were walking down a bare corridor when we were met by a tall, gaunt, disheveled man clad in pajamas and dressing gown, who was introduced to me as Ivor Gurney. He gazed with an intense stare into my face and took me silently by the hand. Then I gave him the flowers, which he took with the same deeply moving intensity and silence. He then said, "You are Helen, Edward's wife, and Edward is dead." I said, "Yes. Let us talk of him." We spoke of country that he knew, and which Edward knew too, and he evidently identified Edward with the English countryside, especially that of Gloucestershire. I learned from the warder that Ivor Gurney refused to go into the grounds of the asylum. It was not his idea at all of countryside, the fields and woods and footpaths he loved so well, and he would have nothing to do with the travesty of something that was sacred to him. The next time I visited, I took with me one of Edward's own well-used ordnance maps of Gloucester, where he had often walked. This proved to have been a sort of inspiration, for Ivor Gurney at once spread it out on the bed, and he and I spent the whole time I was there, tracing with our fingers the lanes and byways of villages, of which he knew every step and over which Edward had walked. He spent that hour in revisiting his beloved home, in spotting a village or a track, a hill or a wood, and seeing it all in his mind's eye, a mental vision sharper and more actual for his heightened intensity. He trod, in a way we who were sane could not emulate, the lanes and fields he knew and loved so well, his guide being his finger tracing the way on the map. It was most deeply moving, and I knew that I had hit on an idea that gave him more pleasure than anything else I could have thought of. For he had Edward as his companion in this strange perambulation. Ivor Gurney died in 1937, after 15 years in that same asylum. He never stopped writing and composing. The last letter we have from Private Percy O'Key is dated the 4th of June, 1918, still from Cork in Ireland. Dear sisters, he writes, many thanks for your welcome letter. I'm glad to hear all at home are in the best of health. As for myself, I'm keeping pretty fair. We're having some lovely weather here at present, and today is a big day, as there's going to be a lot of medals presented to men and widows of soldiers. I see by the papers this morning that things are looking a bit brighter, so I think we have hopes of seeing the end this year. And let's hope it is soon. Well, I've not such a great deal to say this time, but trust you're all still okay. Best love to Mother, Florrie, and Uncle George. And accept same yourselves. Hoping to get a leave in about 3 weeks' time. So cheerio, your loving brother, Percy. But he never seems to have had the leave that he mentions. Instead, his notebook describes him leaving Cork on the 9th of July, travelling to London, apparently alone, then on to Boulogne via Folkestone, before finally reaching Étaples in northern France on the 11th of July, where he joined the 13th Battalion of the King's Liverpool Regiment. There was a story in the family that Percy had been spat on in the street in Ireland, where, of course, the British were seen by many as an occupying force, and he'd asked to be reunited with his unit in France. Then there are just sporadic entries until on the 16th of August he notes that he wrote to the controller of the Post Office Savings Bank to inquire about £6.19 6 he'd invested in war bonds. And then there are just 3 more entries. It says La Souiche, the 18th of August, departed the 19th of August, march 18 miles. 20th of August, line, by which she means the front line. And then nothing else. But remarkably, the Public Records Office at Kew was able to supply us with the battalion war diary for the 13th King's Liverpool Regiment, which corroborates these dates exactly and takes the story forward. The 18th of August. At La Souiche, divine services were held for all denominations. The 19th of August. In the evening, the battalion commenced marching to Ancon. On the early morning of the 20th of August, the battalion arrived and went into close bivouac with the presence of troops concealed. Orders were then received to advance to the southern side of Courcelles-le-Comte, with capturing the Arras-Achier-le-Grand Railway our objective. At 11 p.m., the battalion moved off from bivouacs to assembly positions. The 21st of August. During the early hours of the morning, assisted by a bright moon, the battalion formed up in rear of our front line. The battalion was in position well before 0 hour, which was fixed for 4:55 a.m. At 0 hour, the battalion advanced in artillery formation with tanks in support. A thick mist hung on the ground, increased to great density by the smoke cloud put out to cover the tanks. Direction was extremely difficult. Troops could not be distinguished at 20 yards. All officers were moving by the compass, and this alone enabled a general direction to be kept. Fresh tanks were to have led this advance to the objective, but these did not arrive. And the men pushed on to the barrage, but the fog became so thick and direction so uncertain that progress inevitably slackened. Some of the supporting units, including A and B companies, Percy's company, had no tank assisting, and their arrival at the railway was known to all by the heavy machine gun fire they suddenly came under, and in which many were caught. Reorganization immediately took place, and the east side of the railway was consolidated. There were 95 dead and 263 other casualties, including 5 officers. Just under a month later, 2 letters arrived at 9 Wenlock Street, Hull, addressed to Mrs. Emma Oakey, Percy's mother. We found them in the box. The first is dated the 19th of September 1918, Army Form B10488. Madam, I regret to have to inform you that a report has this day been received from the War Office to the effect that number 56229, Private P. O'Key, of the 13th King's Liverpool Regiment, was posted as missing after the engagement at place not stated on the 21st of August 1918. Should he subsequently rejoin or any other information be received concerning him, such information will be at once communicated to you. Missing. So there would have been some hope. But then, the very next day, a second letter. Army Form B10482. Madam, it is my painful duty to inform you that a report has been received from the War Office notifying the death of number 56229, Private Percy O'Key, of the 13th King's Liverpool Regiment, which occurred at place not stated, on or shortly after the 21st of August, 1918. The report is to the effect that he was killed in action or died of wounds. By His Majesty's command, I am to forward the enclosed message of sympathy from their gracious Majesties, the King and Queen. Apparently, Grandma Oakey always used to say that she knew that something was wrong because Percy's picture, this very photograph, had fallen from the wall on the very day it turned out he'd been killed. Percy O'Key was just one of 17 million people who died on all sides during the First World War. 17 million. Some say 20 million. Others 23 million. No one really knows. A very few of them were poets and artists and composers through whose work we remember the war. But most were ordinary young men and women like Percy O'Key, who loved his mum, liked his cigs, and may have had a girlfriend called Florrie. Never such innocence, never before or since, has changed itself to past without a word. Also in the box was this memorial plaque, carefully preserved in its original packaging and engraved with his name. Apparently, over 1 million of these were distributed to bereaved families after the war. They came to be known as the dead man's penny. He's gone, and all our plans are useless indeed. We'll walk no more on Cotswold, where the sheep feed quietly and take no heed. His body that was so quick is not as you knew it, on Severn River, under the blue, driving our small boat through. You would not know him now, but still he died nobly, so cover him over with violets of pride, purple from Severn's side. Cover him soon, and with thick-set masses of memoried flowers, hide that red, wet thing I must somehow forget. I have come to the borders of sleep, the unfathomable deep forest where all must lose their way, however straight or winding, soon or late, they cannot choose. Many a road and track that since the dawn's first crack up to the forest brink deceived the travelers, suddenly now blurs, and in they sink. Here, love ends. Despair, ambition ends. All pleasure and all trouble, although most sweet or bitter, here ends in sleep that is sweeter than tasks most noble.
There is not any book or face of dearest look I would not turn from now to go into that unknown I must enter and leave alone. I know not how. The tall forest towers. Its cloudy foliage lowers ahead, shelf above shelf. Its silence I hear and obey, that I might lose my way and myself. Watching the dark, my spirit rose in flood, at that most dearest prelude of my delight. The low-lying mist lifted its head. The October stars shone nobly in clear night. When I return unto real music making and play that prelude again, how will it happen then? Shall I feel as I felt, a century hardly waking, with a dull sense of no man's land again? Our own story ends, like so many others, in the lowlands of northern France. We decided to try and find where Percy O'Key was buried. Around this time, my mother had started to show signs of dementia, and she'd begun to talk about this lost uncle she'd never known, her mother's brother. So we wrote to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and received this letter in response. Dear Sir,
Further to your inquiry, we record the following, which is all the information we hold on the casualty. Private Percy O'Key, 56229, the 13th Battalion of the King's Liverpool Regiment, died the 21st of August 1918, commemorated Railway Cutting Cemetery, Courcelles-le-Comte, Pas-de-Calais, France. Grave reference row B, grave 26. A map, travel directions, and a cemetery plan were enclosed, which meant that he was buried in the exact location he'd been killed by the very railway he and his friends had been fighting for all those years ago. It shouldn't have been a surprise. At the time, men fell in such numbers that burying them where they fell without distinction between ranks was a matter of practicality. But after the war, it became highly controversial because many people wanted to repatriate their loved ones and rebury them at home. But of course, that would only have been possible for the relatively wealthy families of officers. A royal commission was established. Among its members was the writer Rudyard Kipling, who famously has lost his own son at the front. And eventually there was a great debate in Parliament, which was carried for the government by Winston Churchill, who argued that not only should the burials remain at the point of death, formalized with the assistance of the French government, but that there should remain equality in death, with no distinction between ranks. And so it came to pass. Perhaps it was a sign of the less deferential, less class-bound society that began to emerge after the war. The railway cutting cemetery at Courcelles-le-Comte is an altogether less grand affair than some of the vast military cemeteries of northern France. We decided to try and visit the grave and set off on a kind of family pilgrimage. With me driving, my mother, her faculties now fading rapidly, my father and my mother's younger sister. On the way to it, we passed the great monumental arch at Thiepval, designed by Sir Edward Lutyens to commemorate the missing of the Somme, those whose bodies had never been found. It stands high on a hillside, you can see it for miles around, faced in white Portland stone, which seems to become grey as you draw near to it, until you realize it's because it's covered in names, 72,000 of them. But at Courcelles-le-Comte, there's just a small car park from which a short gravel path leads to an iron gate and a stone wall, beyond which lies a neatly trimmed green lawn, and the remains of just 95 young men who died on or around the 21st of August 1918, fighting for the Arras-Achier-le-Grand Railway, which still runs exactly alongside. And each one of them representing a story which drops its roots down through the generations, as does every death in every war. Halfway down row B, we came to grave 26. Our own small part of this huge and unfolding tragedy. The final resting place of Private Percy O'Key. On his headstone recorded his name, his regiment, his age, still only 22, and the words which it seems from the correspondence in the box were chosen by his brother George. He did his duty and passed on. Here on this green grass, growing from soil nourished by the very bones of young men whose lives were never to continue, there was an almost unbearable poignancy. This corner of a foreign field was almost literally forever England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and France, Germany, and many other countries too. We paused for a moment. My father said a prayer as my mother and her sister sobbed softly. And I read the 3 poems which form our final group tonight. First, perhaps Wilfred Owen's greatest poem, Futility, with its heart-rending opening line, "Move him into the sun." Then Siegfried Sassoon's great lyric, "Everyone Sang." Perhaps he was thinking of the moments earlier in the war, during the Christmas truces, when the two sides were said to have laid down their weapons and raised their voices together in song. But more generally, it speaks to the indomitability of the human spirit, with its ringing final line, the singing will never be done. And then finally, an extract from a longer poem called For the Fallen by Lawrence Binyon, a very few lines of which are as famous as anything in the English language because they're repeated at every Remembrance Day commemoration, as they will be next week. But the rest of the poem speaks tenderly to the very human need we have to believe that something of us remains at the very end. Move him into the sun. Gently, its touch awoke him once. At home, whispering of fields half sown. Always it woke him, even in France, until this morning and this snow. If anything might rouse him now, the kind old sun will know. Think how it wakes the seeds, woke once the clays of a cold star. Our limbs so dear achieved, our sides full nerved, still warm, so hard to stir. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil to wake earth's sleep at all? Everyone suddenly burst out singing, and I was filled with such delight, as prison birds must find in freedom, winging wildly across the white orchards and dark green fields, on, and out of sight. Everyone's voice was suddenly lifted, and beauty came like the setting sun. My heart was shaken with tears, and horror drifted away. Oh, but everyone was a bird, and the song was wordless. The singing will never be done. They went with songs to the battle. They were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end against odds uncounted. They fell with their faces to the foe. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. They mingle not with their laughing comrades again. They sit no more at familiar tables of home. They have no lot in our labor of the daytime. They sleep beyond England's foam. But where our desires are, and our hopes profound, felt as a wellspring that is hidden from sight, to the innermost heart of our own lands they are known, as the stars are known to the night, as the stars that shall be bright when we are dust, moving in marches upon the heavenly plain, as the stars that shall be starry at the time of our darkness, to the end, they remain.
Thank you very much, Christopher and Gamal, for that incredible production. Obviously, a very moving and emotional and powerful one that brings home to us all the horrors of war. War through the ages, but war which, of course, as we know, is still going on in Ukraine and the Middle East and Africa today. So thank you very much for that. It's obviously a very different production to the sort of concert offering that we have here on a regular basis, but we so much appreciate it. And it is also wonderful to see this church completely packed. It is really so full, but thank you all very much for coming. So thank you very much, Christopher Kent and Gamal Khamis. It's good to know also that you are living locally here in West London. So let's give them all another round of applause. The production, as indeed all of our concerts, has been live streamed and recorded today. So if you would like to watch it again, go when you are home to our website, St. Mary's Perivale, and you can watch it again. Chris and Gamal also have a CD for sale at the back there, if you would like one. It's the production of Enoch Arden, a production that they also did here a few years ago, before COVID, I think, or in between the lockdowns. So that's it for today. I just want to remind everybody that our next concert here is on Tuesday at 2 o'clock on Tuesday, and we have Dmitry Kalashnikov coming to play a 1-hour piano recital. And after that, it's just the usual plea for all of you to be generous, and as you leave, to please, if you haven't already, I know many of you have on the way in, but if you would like to leave a donation, then that always goes to performers. Thank you very much to Rob Jenkins upstairs, who has been doing the recording and the live streaming today, and also to Jill Rowley at the box office. So have a good evening. Thank you very much indeed for coming, and we hope to see you again here soon. Bye.